Hi, I'm Marco Escobar, and this is my CSE 335 final project presentation. So just to touch on my project idea a little bit, essentially this application allows users to find nearby hiking trails to their current location. It brings up a table view of local hikes, and then when they click on one, Apple Maps will open with driving directions from their current location. It also allows users to add hikes to their personal database. Within these hikes, it includes details such as name, a picture, journal entry, rating, distance, difficulty, and even route. It also allows users to view hikes they've done and recorded and even end up finding those hikes on a map view. Also, just to mention, the quote that you see on the bottom of the picture on the right hand side of the screen is gotten from a motivational quote API. And then also just to touch on some tools and technologies that I used to build this application, I used Firebase, more specifically Firestore, for permanent data storage, as well as core location, map kit, and image picker controllers, just to name a few of the Apple technologies that were used to create this. So this is the final class diagram for my final build of my application. And so I built this application using something called model view controller architecture. So I'm just going to go ahead and start out with the model classes and structures that are in this diagram. And I'm actually going to move my mouse over just so you can sort of follow along with which classes I'm talking about. So if you look right here, you'll see that this is the user class, and this is basically the collection in the database. And then the my hike is the document. So basically the user has an array of documents, which in this case is a my hike object. And then from there, so just some of the built-in user functionalities and mainly include just editing the list of hikes. So it's like in here it's called hike list. So whether it be editing the details of that hike or creating a new hike to add to it or removing existing hikes, that's all going to be handled in the user class. And then just to touch sort of on the my hike structure, that's basically where we're going to store all of the things such as the name, distance, mostly as strings, except for the image is actually going to be of a data type, just so it's compressed from a UI image into that data type to be stored in Firestore more efficiently. And then if you're gonna come look over here, this is our API model, and this is basically just gonna handle our API requests every time the application is loaded up. And right here is basically gonna be the structure where we get, which is returned from the API. So it's gonna have a text string and a author string, and essentially what I really only used was the text string to display the motivational quote to the user. And then lastly, up here is our last structure that I would consider part of my model. And this is a nearby hikes, which is basically just going to have an array of strings. And that's just going to be what is displayed to sort of jump into my view and controllers. Into my nearby view controllers, that array of strings is basically just going to be the contents of the table view, which is in this class. And then from here is basically all it's going to be in the whole view controller is a table view of nearby hike names. And then once those hikes are clicked on, then from that point, Apple Maps will open with driving directions from your current location to whichever hike trail that you selected. Then just to jump over here to the right, the My Trails view controller is sort of like the epitome of what the app really does in terms of storing hikes that you have previously added into the database. And this is going to be very similar to the Nearby view controller. It's basically just going to have a table view of hike names, and then when you select on them, it'll open up a detail view controller, which is going to be right here. And then from here, that'll display the things such as images if you decide to select one, as well as all the hike details. All the hike details are optional values, so basically if you leave them blank, then they'll just be empty in this detail view controller unless you wanted to fill them out. And from this detail view controller, you can also edit all of those hike details except for the images, which I'll get into a little bit later. And then from the detail view controller, you can even have the selection to find on a map, and that'll bring you to the map view controller, which will essentially take the name of the hike that you have previously added and actually find it and display it on a map view where you can set control between a satellite or standard map. And that's basically the flow of the application coming into from the main menu view controller into the My Trails view controller. Then just to jump back over here into the Add Trails view controller, this is pretty much does exactly what the title says. It's basically, if you click on this, it'll have a bunch of text fields, and this is where the image picker controller is implemented for the user to upload images and add details to hikes that they have done, even write a journal entry describing the hike and their experience with it. And then last but or not last, but then also the main menu view controller, which just has the name view controller, which is basically just sort of a menu that'll get you individually to the add trail view controller, the nearby view controller, and the my trail view controller. And now last but not least is actually the my trails table view cell. So this is actually a table view cell that is, it's very simple. It just has a title, which is a UI label, and it's shared between the nearby view controller and the my Trails view controller, because essentially the table views only display the primary name of the hike entered. And yeah, this is the final class diagram for my project build. So like I had mentioned earlier, this application was built using model view controller architecture, and this is that diagram. So I'm just going to explain this diagram a little bit. To start off, in the bottom right hand corner, you'll see what is my model, which includes basically the local model, Firestore, which is the cloud database storage, and then the API model as well. So it allows basically user information to be stored both locally and in a database, and then of that user information, it's basically just in an array of hike objects, and then that is also stored both locally and in the Firestore database. And it allows for basically fetching of that data, editing the data, removing the data, whatever data manipulation might be needed, as well as also implementing use of a REST API. This is basically to get a motivational quote and display it on the main menu. And also just to touch on basically to not constantly making queries to the Firestore database. Initially on load, it'll basically just grab the user information and then take all of the hikes that were previously stored for that user and basically just copy it over into a local user object, so we don't have to constantly be making queries to that database every time we want to use that information. So just to jump into the controller section of this model view controller diagram, the controller is going to sort of act between basically the user and then the model to sort of, whether it might be fetch user data, which could be a list of hikes, or even fetch individual hike information, or it could even send new data that the user has entered back to the model and basically have that model update it for the user. It's also going to handle things such as like our table view, image picker, controller maps through data source and delegate methods, and basically going to help determine how these view controller objects might be displayed to the user or might even have an effect on the model. And lastly, just to talk a little bit about the view in this model view controller diagram, the view is basically going to handle all of the things that the user actually sees and interacts with, whether that be showing the user different buttons, labels, text fields, table views, site controls, things of that nature, or even detect user interaction such as scrolling, typing, image selection. Or it's also going to display things like images, or even communicate all the way back through the controller to the model to display whether it be a list of hikes, hike details, the maps and the map views, and all those sort of UI elements that the user is actually going to see and interact with. So some of my favorite capabilities of this application are that it allows users to keep track of hikes while storing things such as like pictures, journal entries, distance, rating, difficulty, even route. And an example of that is directly to the right, where you can see it's just an example of Half Dome and how the user interface really looks. And then this is part of the detail view controller where all this information is actually editable, and you can even see that you could save the changes except for the image, which I'll also get into a little bit later. Another thing I really like about it is it allows users to find hikes they've done on a map view. So if you were to click that little button that says find on map, then the view controller, which is just like a screenshot, a section of it, which is in the upper right hand side where it says Half Dome, that would come up and it actually shows you on a map view where you can find that in the world. It also allows users to get driving directions of nearby hikes. So this is great if you're traveling and let's say, for example, you're in a place you're not too familiar with and you want to find just some hikes where you don't have to, let's say, drive an hour to go actually do them. You can just click on literally find nearby hikes, and then it'll just populate a list of hikes that are close to you. And then if you were to click on one, it'll actually bring up Apple Maps and give you driving directions to that hike. And then the last thing is permanent data storage, and this is basically used to hold all of the user information and hike details I really enjoy this because it's something that's relatively new to me, but it's also something that I think is very important, not only in the world of software development, but also the way I was able to implement it in this application is something that I think is very cool, especially that even things, let's say, that you might have added to your application in a previous time you were using it, then you can go back later and even edit those and have them edit both locally for that use and then also in the cloud storage as well. So I think that is a really cool capability of this app as well. Now, looking at some of the biggest limitations or drawbacks for this current application, especially in its current build, is that one, auto layout is not implemented. This is something I really wanted to do, but unfortunately, if you were to run this, let's say, on an iPad or some other type of device, um, the layout would be all thrown off because it was just implemented using an iPhone 11 Pro Max build. And also, there's no user authentication from within Firestore. So this basically means all of, let's say, the user's hikes are global, meaning anybody that opens the applications will be able to see hikes that anybody who has ever used this application has entered or edited it. And this is something I also really wanted to implement, but with learning a new database management system like Firebase, it's not something that, given the time constraints, I was able to actually get implemented and working, so I decided to not end up using it. And then you can not another implement or limitation is that you cannot edit or add a picture to an existing hike, and this is something that while planning the project I hadn't really thought to account for, and then when I actually went to go and try to add it in at the end, there wasn't really enough space on my detail view controller to add, let's say, like an add height or add picture, edit picture type of button. And also because I hadn't originally planned for this in my planning documents for this project, I decided that, okay, well, if I didn't plan for it, I probably shouldn't try to add it as a functionality on the back end. And then lastly, some hikes are not like sort of popular enough to find on the map, so local city is required. And this is basically what the images below are showing. For example, this is Devil's Bridge in Arizona, more specifically Sedona. So if you were to click Find on Map from the Detail View controller, it'll basically say, could not find trail, please enter city where trail starts. And then if you look at the image on the lower right, you could see that the user entered Sedona and then clicked search again, and then from there was able to find Devil's Bridge Trail. That's mainly just because there's probably so many hikes across America, and just not all of them are searchable from like a global sort of search setting. And I didn't really think of this being an issue until I got to the point where I was actually searching for hikes and realized this was becoming an issue. And instead of going back and changing all of the sort of database fields and adding, let's say, a location that comes with each hike, I just figured this would be like a sort of workaround for the solution, but something that if I were to, let's say, expand on this build, something I would definitely want to fix as well. And some of the best lessons I learned while doing this project, I'd say the biggest one is using Firebase, more specifically Firestore as a database management system. You could see just image examples of that to the right of the screen. Something else is using core location, especially with the local search request and the .open maps functionality to actually open the map in Apple Maps versus displaying it on a map view. Using multi-line text areas versus text views. This was just basically coming from the journal entry section and realizing that a user might need to enter a lot of text, so having that multi-line text area is a very good way to handle that. Having images go between UI images and data for database storage. This was mainly because storing a UI image in a database is way too big, so you need to compress that image and store it as data. And then basically when you get it back, you basically just need to uncompress the data and store it as a UI image instead. And then just refreshing and practicing on other iOS development skills that I've learned prior to this project was a really good thing for me, because this basically used so many different Apple like libraries and just different practices that sort of refreshing on was a really great opportunity. Suggestions for the class project in general is possibly adding a section on Swift UI, just because it's like a much newer user interface builder. Having Firestore tutorials, because that's sort of like the new cloud database system that Firebase has. But overall, I really love this project and this class. I really feel like I gained a lot from it, and thank you so much.